Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, we are back with another video. We're coming in with a true banger, a hoot and a holler, if you will. Today we're going to be talking about the Mount Rushmore of all of MMA. Now, if you're completely uneducated or live under a rock or don't live in the United States, Mount Rushmore consists of 4 people, specifically American founding fathers or leaders, that had the most impact or shaped our country the most out of anyone else. Now right here is the MMA Mount Rushmore. It's classified. If you want to know who the top 4 is right now, you can just skip to the end. But these 4 people that you don't know yet had the, in my opinion, biggest impact in the sport of MMA as a whole. Now, this isn't the best MMA fighters of all time in terms of skill, but it's all about impact. That's what I'm really going over right now. Now, starting off, replacing the George Washington spot, I'm going to have to give it to the one and only Royce Gracie. Now, before you click off, this man, Royce Gracie, is synonymous to George Washington for MMA for many reasons. If you don't know who Royce Gracie is, he was there when UFC debuted in 1993, and this was back when almost everyone was convinced that mixed martial arts as a sport was just barbaric cockfighting. The most popular thing at the time was not even NFL, it was WWE. And everyone knew that shit was scripted. So when people back in 1993 thought about fighting as a sport, it was mainly boxing, or they would just watch professional wrestling. They didn't know about MMA. We know boxing can be boring as shit, and it's a super limited form of fighting to even be considered fighting. Now, in the UFC debut, this event was made to prove that martial arts was the most effective, and Royce was a relatively small dude. He had little intimidating physical presence, and he absolutely shocked the world by beating a much larger and much stronger opponent, such as people like 3 times his weight, professional boxers. He beat them all with the most effective martial art, which is jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Again, Royce deserves this George Washington spot because he set a precedent, you know? The identity of mixed martial arts, where you could be a well-rounded fighter by knowing how to actually fight, not just being like a muscular jack dude with a 12-inch bratwurst. BJJ gyms exploded worldwide, and to this day, every fighter has at least a working knowledge of like submissions just because of him. He's basically the father of modern MMA, Now, coming up next in our Mount Rushmore of MMA fighters, we got the one and only, or I should stop fucking saying that, it's cringy as hell, George St. Pierre. Now, as we know, GSP wasn't the best. He lost a fair share amount of times. But why does he deserve this spot? This dude wasn't just a champion, He was a model of what a mixed martial artist should be. In my opinion, GSP was the most well-rounded fighter of all time. He was the best at demonstrating what it looks to have combined striking, wrestling, submissions, and conditioning at a high professional level. And not only that, but he also showed that preparation and just straight up discipline can beat raw talent, He showed that wrestling control was the blueprint for beating super dangerous opponents that can knock the shit out of you or turn your face unrecognizable. And most importantly, why he's even on this list of the Mount Rushmore of MMA fighters, he's the best representation of like the model attitude of an MMA fighter. He was respectful, and he was a humble person outside of the cage. Now, why was this super important? Like I said earlier in the video, MMA at first was seen as like some barbaric human cockfighting fest. But GSP, being the absolute savage that he was in the octagon and showing himself as humble, respectful person, that really helped take out the stigma of MMA being some like bullshit and barbaric sport. And he like influenced MMA to be seen as like a real sport that had regulations, rules, and safety protocols, and true recognizable legacies in sports, in the sports world as a whole. Like, he set the gold standard for being a professional fighter, both inside and outside of the cage. And that's why I think he deserves to have a spot on the top 4 most influential MMA fighters of all time. Now, coming up third in my list of MMA Mount Rushmore fighters, give me Conor McGregor. I feel like it's impossible to make a Mount Rushmore of MMA fighters who had the biggest impact on the sport and not putting Conor McGregor on here. Now, unless you live under a fucking rock, you should know who Conor McGregor is. Even my mom knows who Conor McGregor is, and I don't even think she can even tell me what the UFC is. Conor McGregor completely changed the business side of UFC. Now, in terms of being a mixed martial artist, his career on paper might have been kind of dog shit. I mean, he had a pretty good career, but I believe his very short prime, which was his rise to the featherweight title, that version of Conor McGregor was one of the greatest MMA fighters of all time, just in terms of skill. But that does get overshadowed a lot when he got slimed by Nate Diaz the next fight. Yeah. Shout out Nate Diaz. But anyway, Conor McGregor interacted with the UFC fan base like no other's ever seen. Like, not even in any other sport. He broke pay-per-view records left and right again and again. He brought mainstream attention to MMA in ways never seen before. It's because people gave a shit about him, and that's what made a lot of money. Unless you still believe in Santa Claus, sports as a whole is just a whole business. Why do you think good teams or divisional rivalries get flexed on primetime in the NFL? Because it makes the money. People want to see those matches. They don't want to see the freaking Panthers versus the Cardinals. That shit's boring. Why do you think professional leagues try to build a big star like Messi, Ronaldo, Patrick Mahomes, and they give them big attention, such as commentators glazing Mahomes? It's because it makes the money. The more people that give a shit about the sport, the more money is being made. And that's the most important thing, because sports are a business. Conor McGregor made other fighters realize that self-promotion and branding, it could massively boost both your earning power, making money, and the opportunities to fight higher contenders, because people want to watch you fight. Because why do you think it took Ankalaev so long to get a title shot? Because the fucker lives in a cave somewhere in Russia, and no one gives a shit about him. If you're not from the Republic of God knows where, probably Dagestan. That's why UFC is moving to Paramount Plus, because nobody gives a shit about these champions and nobody's buying pay-per-views. Now, lastly on the list, I know there's going to be a lot of salty new gens here, and I get it. But still, even in terms of influence on the sport of MMA as a whole, I have to give it to the GOAT, Jon Jones. Now, I know his last days leading up to retirement, it stirred a lot of rage and hatred. And I also believe he kind of brought down the sport of MMA as an influential figure. I know many times over and over he's got fucked with PED use. He fucked up the UFC 200 main event. And he's a cheater. I get that. But what he's done for the sport completely outweighs those negatives. Like, he debuted in UFC as a 21-year-old, completely changing the expectations of what a fighter can do inside a cage. Jon, he just demonstrated that age and experience wasn't really a factor when he had the mentality of a GOAT. He used spinning elbows, oblique kicks, unorthodox clinching, which is like pretty much unheard of in MMA. I mean, at that time at least. You know, Jon became the youngest UFC champion ever at just 23 years old. You know, his skill showed you that you can master multiple styles at once, not just be good at one thing, like boxing or wrestling. I know I've already said this with GSP, but GSP's entitlement of being on the Mount Rushmore was doing this while also being a genuine and great human being all around. But he was less dominant than Jon Jones. On Jon's end, he was kind of a shit human being, and everyone knew that. But he demonstrated what it meant to be the best fighter of all time. Like, title defense after title defense. He literally dominated a whole era of light heavyweights. And many of whom, those people who he dominated, they're already considered legends of the sport. And that made him the most feared fighter of all time. And he's never fucking lost, bro. I mean, you can make a case for the Dominic Reyes fight. I know he lost that fight, but think about it. Dude, Jon didn't even go through a training camp, and Reyes put his heart, mind, and soul into that fight. And still, Jon, after not even going through a fucking training camp, still put on a performance that was somewhat convincing to the judges that he won the fight, which is impressive in and of itself, you know. John demonstrated how MMA could be treated as a sport and not some street fight with somebody you hate, you know. He watched hours of film, studied his opponents, which is a characteristic that is needed in any dominating and winning sports team slash athlete. You know, athleticism, adaptability, IQ, it creates unstoppable dominance. John I want to say single-handedly, but he had the biggest factor in raising the ceiling of what MMA athletes could achieve and influenced a new generation of training and creativity. And I believe he truly gave MMA the identity of a sport and not just cockfighting. He's the one that solidified MMA as a literal sport. Well, anyway, if you've made it to the end of my yapping, I really appreciate you and I love you. And I hope you do well in life. Goblin MMA out.